My name is Adriana Beaumont. I'm 32 years old, and 6 weeks ago, at an emergency family meeting called by my Uncle Philip, 7 relatives sat around our family business's conference table and one by one told me they believed I was responsible for $50,000 missing from the company safe. Nobody asked to see the building's badge access logs before reaching that conclusion. I had already pulled them myself 3 days earlier, and they showed I hadn't swiped into the building at all on the day the money disappeared. I didn't argue at that meeting. I let everyone finish speaking, thanked them for their time, and told them I'd have something for them within the week. I already had it sitting in an email draft, unsent, waiting. To understand why I stayed so calm, you need to go back 4 years, to the week I started working in a family business I'd once sworn I'd never touch. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word logged in the comments if you've ever had to prove your innocence with something more solid than your own word. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that meeting makes sense. My family runs Beaumont & Sons Hardware, a chain of 6 hardware stores across the Ohio Valley that my grandfather started in 1968 and that's since passed, informally and not always smoothly, through 2 generations of family management. My father managed the flagship store for decades before retiring 5 years ago, and my Uncle Philip, his younger brother, now serves as the company's general manager, overseeing all 6 locations from a small central office attached to the original store. I grew up spending summers stocking shelves and running the register at that flagship location, memories that carry a genuine fondness, even alongside the complicated family politics that always seemed to swirl around who was doing enough for the business and who wasn't. I spent most of my 20s deliberately building a career outside the family business, working in corporate accounting for a regional bank, partly because I genuinely enjoyed the work, and partly, if I'm honest, because I'd watched enough family tension over the business growing up to want some distance from it. Old disputes between my father and Philip about expansion decisions, disagreements about hiring family members into roles they weren't necessarily qualified for, the ordinary friction of a business that had never fully separated itself from the family running it. I came back 4 years ago, not because I'd changed my mind about family business politics, but because the company genuinely needed help. An external audit had flagged serious inconsistencies in how the company tracked inventory shrinkage and cash reconciliation across its 6 locations. Inconsistencies that had been quietly costing the business real money for years, without anyone having the specific financial background to properly diagnose the problem. My Uncle Philip, capable in many ways but never particularly strong with detailed financial systems, asked me directly if I'd consider coming on as the company's controller, overseeing exactly the kind of financial infrastructure the business had been missing. I negotiated a fair salary, set clear boundaries about not getting pulled into unrelated family politics, and accepted, genuinely optimistic about finally putting my accounting background toward something that mattered to people I loved. The first 3 years went reasonably well. I redesigned the company's cash handling procedures across all 6 stores, implemented proper reconciliation protocols, and caught several genuine problems. A store manager quietly padding his own hours, a vendor overcharging on a recurring supply contract, the unglamorous, detail-oriented work that rarely gets celebrated but genuinely protects a business's bottom line. I want to be honest that this work occasionally made me unpopular, since tightening financial controls inevitably means someone, somewhere, loses a bit of the flexibility they'd grown used to. I accepted that friction as a normal cost of doing the job properly. The central office where I work, attached to the flagship store, uses a keycard badge system for building access, installed about 2 years ago as part of a broader security upgrade following a break-in at one of the satellite locations. Every employee with office access has an individually assigned badge, and the system logs every single entry and exit with a timestamp, standard practice for a business handling meaningful amounts of cash and sensitive financial records. I genuinely never thought much about that system before 6 weeks ago, beyond appreciating it as a reasonable security measure. The money went missing on a Thursday from the office safe where the company temporarily holds cash deposits from all 6 stores before their scheduled bank run each Friday morning. $50,000, an unusually large amount even for a Thursday, because that particular week had included a large cash payment from a commercial contractor client who'd insisted on paying in cash for a bulk order. A legitimate but unusual transaction that meant more money than normal was sitting in that safe overnight. Something I remember specifically flagging to Philip at the time as a slight departure from our normal cash handling volume. A small irony I've thought about often since. I found out about the missing money the following Monday morning, when my Uncle Philip called an emergency meeting of the company's senior staff, myself included, to announce that Friday's bank deposit had come up exactly $50,000 short, and that the discrepancy had been confirmed after a full recount and review of Thursday's transaction records. I remember sitting in that first meeting genuinely shocked, running through my own memory of that Thursday, trying to figure out what I might have seen or noticed that could help explain what had happened, mentally retracing a day that had, at the time, felt entirely unremarkable. It was in the days following that first meeting that I started to notice a shift in how certain relatives were looking at me. I want to be honest that I understand, on some level, why suspicion might have initially included me. I'm the person responsible for the company's financial controls. I have legitimate access to the safe's combination as part of my role, and family businesses, I've learned, have a particular tendency to assume financial problems trace back to whoever holds the most direct financial authority, rather than considering the full range of people with physical access. What I didn't expect was how quickly that initial, reasonable scrutiny curdled into something closer to a settled conclusion, well before anyone had actually gathered the evidence that should have informed it. I noticed it first in small ways. A slightly longer pause before a cousin returned my greeting at the store. A conversation that stopped abruptly when I walked into the break room. The specific discomfort of realizing people were choosing their words differently around me than they had just a week earlier. My cousin Trent, who manages one of the satellite stores and has never been particularly warm toward me since I returned to the company 4 years ago, was the first to say it explicitly in a phone call to my aunt that got relayed back to me secondhand within a day. Adriana's the one with access to everything. She's the one who redesigned all these systems. If anyone knows how to make 50 grand disappear cleanly, it's her. I want to note the specific unfairness of that logic, because it stayed with me for weeks afterward. The very competence I'd brought to protecting the company's finances was being used as evidence against me, as though understanding a system thoroughly enough to secure it also meant understanding it well enough to exploit it. There was, I remember thinking at the time, a strange kind of backhanded compliment buried inside the accusation, a grudging acknowledgement of my abilities immediately weaponized against me. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first days of suspicion, before it hardened into that formal meeting. It was a specific, disorienting kind of loneliness, watching people I'd known my entire life, people who'd attended my college graduation and my wedding, quietly recalibrate their sense of who I was, based on nothing more than proximity to a problem. I found myself replaying old family gatherings in my head, wondering whether the warmth I'd always assumed was genuine had actually been more conditional than I'd realized. A question I'm not sure I've fully answered even now, 6 weeks after everything was resolved. I want to describe that meeting honestly because I think the specifics matter. It took place in the same conference room where we hold monthly operations meetings, 7 relatives arranged around the long table my grandfather had originally bought secondhand decades earlier, still in use despite its scratched surface and slightly uneven legs. Nobody accused me with hard evidence. What they had, collectively, was a narrative built entirely from circumstance, my financial access, my recent redesign of the very systems now in question, and, most painfully, a general sense, articulated carefully by my Aunt Diane, that I'd always kept to myself a bit, never really let the family all the way in. As though my professional boundaries over the years amounted to some kind of ongoing concealment, rather than simply reasonable workplace conduct. She said it gently, almost sympathetically, in the tone of someone offering an explanation rather than an accusation, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd simply been angry. My cousin Trent spoke next, more directly, repeating a version of what he'd apparently already said to my aunt on the phone days earlier. "I'm not saying I know for a fact it was you, Adriana. I'm just saying you're the one who knows every system in this building better than anyone else, and that has to count for something when we're trying to figure out what happened." I remember sitting there, watching him say this with an expression of genuine, almost reluctant concern, as though he found the accusation as uncomfortable to voice as I found it to hear, which somehow made it feel more credible to the room than if he'd simply been hostile about it. My own father, sitting at that table, said very little, which hurt in a way I hadn't fully prepared for, a silence that felt, in the moment, like its own kind of accusation. I kept waiting for him to say something, anything, in my defense, and the longer the silence stretched, the more I understood that it wasn't coming, at least not that day. I didn't defend myself extensively in that meeting. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story people understand least. I'd already, 3 days before that meeting, quietly requested the building's complete badge access log for the week in question from our security system vendor, a routine request any authorized administrator can make, which I happen to be, given my role overseeing office operations. I hadn't shared it with anyone yet, partly because I wanted to review it thoroughly myself first, and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me wanted to see exactly how far the family's assumptions would go before I corrected them with something undeniable, rather than my own increasingly exhausted verbal defense. I received the log the following day, a clean, time-stamped spreadsheet listing every badge swipe in and out of the office for the entire week, organized by employee name and exact time. I want to describe what I felt reading it because it wasn't quite what I expected. I'd known, of course, that I hadn't taken the money. That was never genuinely in question for me. What surprised me was how stark the log made everything look, laid out plainly on a page, stripped of any interpretation or narrative, just cold, undeniable timestamps. I remember scrolling through it at my kitchen table that evening, a glass of wine going untouched beside my laptop, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and a kind of quiet sadness that vindication needed to come from a spreadsheet rather than from the people who'd known me my whole life simply believing me. On the Thursday in question, my badge showed a single swipe in at 9:02 a.m. and a swipe out at 11:47 a.m. for a dentist appointment I'd had that morning, followed by no further entry for the rest of the day. I'd worked remotely that afternoon, something I did occasionally with Philip's knowledge, reviewing quarterly reports from my home office, a detail I could further corroborate through my own computer login records, and a video call I'd had with our external auditor that same afternoon. A call that was, conveniently, still sitting in my calendar with a timestamp and the auditor's own contact information attached. The safe, according to the store's internal transaction log, had been accessed twice that Thursday, once in the morning by the store's assistant manager, Colin, making a routine deposit from the morning's register counts, and once in the late afternoon, at 4:38 p.m., by a badge registered to my cousin Trent, who, according to his own scheduled hours, shouldn't have had any reason to be at the flagship location that day at all, since he managed a different store nearly 20 minutes away. I remember reading that specific timestamp 3 or 4 times, making certain I wasn't misreading it, before the full weight of what it might mean actually settled in. I sat with that information for 2 full days before deciding what to do with it. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to simply forward the log to the entire family immediately, publicly, the same way the accusation against me had been made. A small, understandable impulse toward the same kind of public reckoning I'd been subjected to. I decided against that approach, ultimately, because I didn't want to replicate the same rushed, circumstantial style of judgment that had been used against me, jumping to a conclusion about Trent's badge swipe without first understanding the full context behind it. There could, in theory, have been a legitimate reason for him to be there that day, something I owed him the basic fairness of investigating properly rather than assuming. Instead, I brought the log privately to Philip, requesting he initiate a proper confidential review through the company's actual investigative channels, rather than allowing another round of family speculation to take over. Philip reviewed the log with visible discomfort and initiated a formal review, pulling security camera footage from the flagship store's back office for that Thursday afternoon, footage that the badge log alone couldn't fully explain on its own. I remember Philip calling me 2 days into that review, his voice heavy, saying only, "I need you to come by the office. There's something on the footage you should see before I take this any further." The footage, reviewed jointly by Philip and our company's outside legal counsel over the following week, showed Trent entering the office that afternoon, opening the safe using a combination he technically still had access to from his years working at the flagship location before his transfer to the satellite store, and removing a substantial stack of cash, which he was later found to have used, over the following weeks, to cover a series of gambling debts he'd been hiding from his wife and the rest of the family for months. I called the second family meeting myself, 6 weeks after the first one, with Philip's support, presenting the badge log and the subsequent findings plainly, without dramatics, to the same 7 relatives who'd sat around that table weeks earlier and told me they believed I was responsible. I remember choosing my words carefully beforehand, wanting to present the facts without a trace of the bitterness I genuinely felt, believing that the timeline itself would carry more weight delivered calmly than it would wrapped in justified anger. I watched their faces as I walked through the timeline, my own badge log showing my absence, the internal transaction record showing Trent's presence, the video footage confirming what the record suggested. My Aunt Diane, who'd spoken about my supposed emotional distance from the family, was the first to speak once I finished. "Adriana, I owe you a real apology. I said something about you keeping to yourself, and I think I was looking for a reason to explain a suspicion I already had, instead of actually looking at what was in front of me." My father, who'd said almost nothing in that first meeting, spoke last, and his words affected me more than I expected. I sat there and let 7 people accuse my own daughter without saying a single word in your defense, because some part of me was afraid of what it would mean about this family if I was wrong to doubt you. I'm sorry, Adriana. That's not something I can take back, but I want you to know I see it clearly now. Trent wasn't at that second meeting. He'd been confronted privately by Philip and our legal counsel 2 days earlier, admitted to taking the money, and agreed to a repayment plan alongside consequences that included stepping back from his management position at the satellite store, pending the family's decision about his longer-term role in the business. I haven't spoken to him directly since, though I understand, through my aunt, that he's begun some form of counseling for the gambling issues that led to this in the first place, something I hope genuinely helps him, even as I remain honestly unsure how much trust I'll be able to extend him again. My Aunt Diane mentioned gently a few weeks ago that Trent had asked whether I might be willing to talk with him eventually, once some time had passed. I told her I wasn't ready yet, and that I appreciated her not pushing me toward forgiveness on any timeline other than my own. 6 weeks have passed since that second meeting. My relationship with the family remains, in most respects, warmer than it's been in years, an unexpected outcome of a genuinely painful several weeks. My father and I have had several long conversations since, the kind we hadn't had in a long time, about the specific fear that had kept him silent in that first meeting. A fear, he explained, rooted in watching his own father navigate similar family business disputes decades earlier, disputes that had occasionally fractured relationships permanently. He told me, sitting on his back porch one evening, that he'd learned, growing up, to stay quiet during family conflicts rather than risk making them worse. A habit formed long before I was born that he'd never fully examined until it cost him something he genuinely regretted. I've come to understand his silence a little differently, without fully excusing it, recognizing it as its own kind of inherited pattern rather than a simple failure of love. I've thought, too, about the particular cruelty of being suspected specifically because of competence, a dynamic I hadn't fully appreciated until I lived through it myself. The financial systems I'd spent 4 years building to protect this company from exactly this kind of loss became, in the eyes of frightened relatives looking for an explanation, evidence against the very person who'd built them. I don't think this is unique to my family. I think it's a pattern that plays out in workplaces and families everywhere. Whenever something goes wrong and people reach, understandably but unfairly, for the person who understands the system best, rather than doing the slower, more careful work of actually determining what happened. I think about that first meeting sometimes, sitting there while 7 relatives told me, plainly, that they believed I'd stolen from the family. I don't feel real anger toward most of them anymore, even my Aunt Diane, whose comments stung the most in the moment. I think fear and uncertainty make people reach for the fastest, most available explanation, and I happened to be standing closest to the systems in question when that explanation needed a name attached to it. I do think, though, that the experience taught me something important about the specific vulnerability of being the person who understands a system well enough to protect it. That same competence can, unfairly, become the first thing people point to when something within that system goes wrong. If you're watching this and you've ever been blamed for something, specifically because you were the person most qualified to prevent it, I want you to hear this, because I spent 2 weeks quietly gathering proof instead of simply demanding to be believed. And I've come to think that instinct, while it worked out, shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. Competence isn't guilt. Understanding a system doesn't make you the most likely person to exploit it. Often, it makes you the most likely person to notice when someone else already has. Sometimes the truth is sitting quietly in a time-stamped log somewhere, waiting for someone to actually check it before deciding who to believe. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you were blamed for something you didn't do, and what it took to finally clear your name. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a man whose business partner accused him of falsifying quarterly reports 3 days before the accounting firm's own audit trail proved exactly whose login had made every single edit.